Okay, so let's dive right into this. Today's deep dive is all about the California wildfires, and specifically the whole insurance mess that's come out of it. We've got a really interesting mix of stuff to look at today: financial reports, opinion pieces, and even some practical guides for homeowners.
Yeah, it's a fascinating situation. It brings together so many different things: natural disasters, the economy, and even personal decisions about where people choose to live and how they protect their property.
Exactly. So our goal today is to help you understand not just the damage from the fires themselves, but also all these complicated factors that are at play. We want you to walk away truly informed.
Yeah, and to grasp the gravity of all this, we need to start with the human impact. The Los Angeles area fires alone have tragically claimed at least 16 lives, and that number is expected to rise.
Yeah, it's heartbreaking. And beyond the human cost, the financial devastation is just staggering. We could be looking at the nation's most expensive fire ever, billions of dollars in insured losses. AccuWeather estimated the total economic damage could reach somewhere between $135 and $150 billion.
Wow. To put that in perspective, that's bigger than the entire economies of many countries. So this raises a critical question. Who pays for all this when a disaster of this scale hits?
Right, and that's where Moody's report comes in. They've listed the major insurers facing these huge losses. Names like State Farm, Farmers, Liberty Mutual, Allstate, Travelers. But there's another player that's emerging as a key factor here: California's FAIR plan.
Yeah, the FAIR plan is basically the safety net for homeowners and businesses who can't get coverage in a regular insurance market. And it's growing rapidly, which is a big red flag. It shows just how difficult it's becoming to get insurance in California, especially in fire-prone areas.
So we're seeing a strained insurance system. And one of the articles you shared from the LA Times suggests that California's laws, specifically those limiting insurance premiums, might actually be part of the problem.
That's where things get really interesting. The article argues that by capping insurance premiums, the state might actually be discouraging insurers from covering high-risk areas. It's classic supply and demand. Think of it like this. What if the government suddenly capped the price of gas? Would oil companies be as willing to produce and sell it, especially if their costs were going up?
Probably not. They wouldn't be making enough profit to justify the risk.
Exactly. So applying that same logic to insurance, if premiums can't reflect the actual risk of insuring a property in a fire-prone area, insurers are less likely to offer coverage. And the numbers really back this up. A staggering 2.8 million homeowner policies were dropped in California between 2020 and 2022. That's millions of people facing enormous risk without insurance.
Wow, that's a huge number. It makes you wonder how many of those people are now scrambling for coverage or are forced to go without, and what that means for their peace of mind.
Yeah, it's a real dilemma. And it leads to another complex issue, highlighted in the comments section of that LA Times article: the ethics of pricing during emergencies. There's a huge debate about whether price gouging is ever justifiable, especially after a disaster.
Yeah, that's a tough one. Some people argue that it's completely immoral to exploit people's desperation, while others say that raising prices is the only way to get suppliers to bring in much-needed resources after a crisis.
It's a clash between ethics and economic arguments. We're not here to pick sides. We just want to lay out both perspectives so you can think critically about all the complexities.
Absolutely. So we've got all these economic pressures
Right.
and ethical debates swirling around. But let's bring it back down to earth for a minute and focus on what homeowners in these high-risk areas can actually do to protect themselves. That Frontline article you shared had some really practical advice.
It did. A crucial first step is understanding your current insurance policy. What does it actually cover? What are the exclusions? What's your deductible? In fire-prone areas, you might need to look at alternatives, like the FAIR plan or surplus lines carriers, which we talked about earlier.
Yeah, this is stuff you should really be asking yourself. Do you actually know the ins and outs of your policy? Are you aware of all your options?
Right, because ultimately, what works for one homeowner might not be the best solution for another. It depends on their individual circumstances, risk tolerance, and of course, their budget.
And speaking of options, we have to talk about the California moratorium on policy cancellations and non-renewals, which is in effect until September 2024. It's a temporary lifeline for some homeowners who are afraid of losing coverage. But what happens after that? It's a big question mark.
It really is. It brings us to a crucial question. Is this moratorium a real solution? Or is it just delaying the inevitable? It buys some time, but it doesn't solve the root causes of this insurance crisis in California.
Yeah, it feels like we're stuck in this holding pattern, while the threat of these wildfires is still out there.
It is a race against time. And it highlights how important it is to understand the bigger picture. These wildfires aren't just isolated incidents. They're part of a much larger trend, driven by climate change, development pushing further into the wildland, and forest management practices.
It really is all connected, and I think that's where knowledge is so powerful. The more we understand these systems, the better prepared we'll be to make smart decisions and push for change.
Absolutely. It goes beyond just individual actions. We need these conversations happening at every level, our communities, within the state, and nationally. That's how we build lasting solutions.
So it's not just about finding the right insurance policy, it's about starting a dialogue, about building a more resilient future.
Exactly. And everyone needs a seat at the table. Policymakers, scientists, business leaders, and everyday citizens like us.
Well said. Now that LA Times article, which definitely seemed to have a particular slant, suggested that government regulation is part of the problem.
Yeah, the author argues that capping insurance premiums has actually made the shortage of coverage worse, especially in those high-risk fire zones. It's a case of good intentions, leading to unintended consequences.
The law of unintended consequences. Then we have the California moratorium on policy cancellations and non-renewals, a government intervention meant to help homeowners.
Yeah, it's a Band-Aid solution, but it shows the role that the government plays in both mitigating risk and providing a safety net for those impacted.
So it's all about balance. We don't want too much regulation. That stifles the market. But we do need the government to step in and protect people, especially during a crisis like this.
It's a tricky balance to find, but it's crucial to recognize the government's role in all this and hold our elected officials accountable for making informed decisions that benefit everyone.
Which brings us back to being informed citizens. We can't just sit back and wait for the government to fix everything. We need to get involved and advocate for the solutions we believe in.
Absolutely. And that goes for everything, not just wildfire insurance, every issue that impacts our lives and communities. Speaking of taking action, that Frontline article had some good advice about what to do after a wildfire if you need to file a claim. They stress the importance of documentation.
It's all about being prepared. They recommend taking photos and videos of your belongings before a fire, just in case. It sounds a bit morbid, but it's a really smart move.
Yeah, like creating a visual inventory and after a fire. They say it's critical to document the damage thoroughly and keep track of all your expenses. It's essential for a smooth claims process.
They also said not to throw away damaged items too quickly. You might need them as evidence.
Right. Dealing with insurance can be a headache, but being organized can make a big difference.
And if you're ever feeling lost, there are resources out there. You can contact your state's insurance commissioner or reach out to consumer advocacy groups.
It's good to know where to go for help, and that brings up a bigger point, the importance of community and support networks. Because ultimately, it's about people coming together to help each other through these tough times.
I love that. It's a reminder that it's not just about insurance policies, economic models. It's about human connection and supporting one another.
Beautifully said. It's that spirit of resilience and compassion that will help us face whatever comes next. And speaking of challenges, there was one final point that I wanted to bring up from the LA Times comments section.
Oh, I see.
One commenter said that California is essentially a desert, and maybe we need to rethink. Having so many people living in such a dry place, so prone to wildfires.
Wow, that's a thought-provoking statement. It raises questions about sustainability, resource management, even population density. Are we pushing the limits of this environment, and what does that mean for the future?
It's a question worth considering. And it ties into climate change and the increasing frequency of these extreme weather events. Are we going to see more of this in the future? More people living in areas at high risk of natural disasters?
It's definitely a lot to think about. But even if they're tough, I think it's important to have these conversations.
I completely agree, because ultimately it's about facing reality and working together to create a more sustainable and equitable future for everyone.
And that ties into the practical advice from Frontline about fire-resistant building materials and landscaping techniques to create defensible space around your property.
Those are all important steps for homeowners, but it also raises the issue of affordability. Can everyone afford to do those things? What about people who are already struggling financially?
That's a good point. It highlights how these disasters can worsen existing inequalities. Those who are already vulnerable often get hit the hardest. We need solutions that address these disparities and make sure everyone has access to resources and support.
Absolutely. We need equitable resilience, building a future where everyone can thrive, regardless of their income or background.
It requires a change in thinking We can't just focus on rebuilding what was lost. We need to build back better, creating communities that are more resilient and sustainable.
I couldn't agree more. It's about moving beyond just reacting to disasters and embracing a more proactive vision for the future.
Asking ourselves, what kind of world do we want, and how can we create it?
It's about recognizing that we have the power to shape our future. And that begins with understanding the challenges, engaging in meaningful conversations, and taking action. It really is about changing how we think and realizing that we can actually do something about it. And that brings us back to that question we asked earlier. What happens if climate change just keeps fueling more of these intense wildfires? How does the insurance industry adapt?
Yeah, it's the million-dollar question.
Yeah.
And honestly, this current model, where we just keep rebuilding in these high-risk areas and rely on insurance to cover the cost, it just doesn't feel sustainable long-term.
Yeah, I agree. We can't keep doing the same thing and expect different results. Things have to change. And one shift we might see is risk-based pricing.
And what would that look like for homeowners?
Basically, your insurance premium would be directly tied to the risk. So homes in those really risky fire zones would probably see their premiums go way up, maybe even to the point where it's unaffordable.
Yeah, that's tough. It feels like you're punishing people for living in places that have always been desirable.
It's definitely a difficult situation, but it underscores the need to be more proactive about reducing risk. Think stricter building codes, fire prevention measures on a large scale, maybe even changing land use planning to account for wildfire risk. We need to build smarter.
So it's about a fundamental shift in how we think about development and our relationship with the natural world.
Exactly. We can't just keep ignoring these forces of nature. We have to learn to live with them. And that might mean making some tough choices, like rethinking the idea of rebuilding in some areas that are just too vulnerable to wildfires.
Yeah, it's a conversation we need to have. And who makes those decisions? Individual homeowners. Or do we need more government involvement with land use and zoning?
It's a complex issue with no easy answers, but it shows how important it is to have open dialogue and collaboration between everyone involved. Policymakers, scientists, community leaders. We need solutions that work for everyone.
And we can't forget that these disasters don't impact everyone equally. We've talked about the financial burden on homeowners, but what about the social and environmental impacts?
You're right. These wildfires often make existing inequalities worse. Low-income communities, people with disabilities, the elderly, they often don't have the resources to prepare or recover. And the environmental damage is huge. Lost habitat, air pollution, it takes ecosystems a long time to recover.
It's a reminder that these wildfires are more than just a financial issue. They have a ripple effect on our health, communities, and the planet.
And that brings us back to the idea of a more resilient future. It's not just about putting out fires. It's about tackling the root causes, reducing those risks, and building communities that can weather the storm.
Which leads us to the end of our deep dive today. We've looked at these California wildfires from all sides: the human cost, the economic fallout, the role of government, the insurance industry, and the importance of individual action. What do you hope people take away from all this?
I hope they feel empowered, not overwhelmed. We covered a lot, but the main takeaway is this: knowledge is power. The more we understand these issues, the better we can make informed choices, advocate for change, and create a more resilient future.
Couldn't have said it better myself. Keep learning, keep asking questions, and keep having these conversations, because the future is something we create together.
And remember, while we focused on California, these challenges aren't unique to one place. Climate change is global. And what we've talked about today applies to communities all over the world.
So to wrap things up, here's one final thought. The future isn't set in stone. We have the power to shape it. And by understanding how everything is connected, like we've discussed today, we can build a more sustainable, equitable, and resilient world.